Welcome back to my channel. This unusual criminal case shows how complicated are the psychological mechanisms affecting the behavior of witnesses to crimes. The truth about a crime can be hidden by witnesses for years, and this can happen for very different reasons. This case also shows that even if a witness eventually decides to confess the truth, the road to do so is very long and difficult. It's 1956, and 21-year-old Diane works at her father's grocery store in Peoria, Illinois in USA. Diane has been divorced for 2 years and is raising her daughter Susie alone. At the store she meets nice Dianne Keidel, a bachelor. The youngsters fall in love with each other and get married a year later. They move to Phoenix, Arizona, where Dianne gets a job as a machine operator and eventually, as a self-employed person, starts working for a construction company. Diane takes an office job. Meanwhile, their children Greg, Kelly, and Lori are born. The marriage, however, is not going well. Dianne drinks a lot and is often very aggressive, the spouses constantly argue, and there are cases of physical violence. Diane has had enough, and in July 1966, it's then the 10th anniversary of their marriage, she files for divorce. Her husband moves out and goes to live with his father. It's not very far, as it's about a mile from the house where his wife and children now live without him. Dianne's move out causes the atmosphere in the house to change immediately. Arguments and attacks of aggression stop. As it seems, both spouses come to the conclusion that the separation will work out for everyone and the divorce should be carried out. What happened on September 17, 1966 is known mainly from Dianne's later accounts. Here is the course of events at the time. In the evening, Dianne, along with Diane and the children, goes to dinner at the Taco Bell restaurant. After the meal, around 9 p.m., Dianne and Diane drive the children home and return to the restaurant. The topic of their conversation is matters related to the divorce, financial issues, and contact arrangements with the children. According to Dianne's account, the meeting proceeds in a pleasant atmosphere. The two leave the restaurant around 11:15 p.m., and Diane drives him to his current home and reportedly even goes inside for a while. What Diane does next is known from the accounts of impartial witnesses. She goes to the Ambering restaurant, where she is seen by various people. There she drinks in the company of Bob Marley. This is a man with whom she began dating some time after her separation from her husband. According to Dianne, he wakes up shortly after Diane leaves and goes down to the phone booth. He wants to call his wife at home to see if she got there, since he has no idea about her planned meeting with Bob. The phone at Diane's house is answered by her daughter Susie. Since the girl says her mom is not there, Dianne goes on foot to Diane's house and gets there just after midnight. He says that while waiting for his wife to return, he falls asleep on the sofa at about 3 a.m. and waking up at about 5:30 a.m., which is 2.5 hours later, he sees Diane's car parked in the driveway. She herself is supposedly no longer there, so he assumes that in the interval between 3 and 5:30 a.m. his wife returned and left again. Diane does not appear at home and gives no sign of life. Dianne reports her missing to the police. Officers are certain that Diane made it home after meeting Bob, as they find her purse, her keys lying on the kitchen table, and her car parked on the driveway. It also appears that nothing of her clothing or other personal belongings has disappeared. After preliminary questioning, police also find no motive for Diane to abandon her children so suddenly. Police officers working in the missing persons unit have doubts that Diane really went off somewhere and abandoned her children, since they hear from everyone who knows her, including her mother, brother, and neighbors, that she took great care of them and even tried not to leave them alone for long periods of time. When the police want to question Bob Marley, it turns out that 2 days after meeting Diane, he died of a heart attack. So if he even knew something about her death, he will not be able to be asked about it ever again. 2 days after his wife's disappearance, Dianne moves into her house to take care of the children. He tells them that their mother ran away from home with another man. He tells this, as well, to neighbors and friends, and to anyone who asks about Diane's sudden disappearance. He also insists on it when talking to police officers. He even gives them a list of names of men his wife has been seeing since the separation. It's hard to say who believes the version of events he gives and who doesn't, but the fact is that there are rumors in the neighborhood that Diane is lying buried in her yard. This information is also reaching the police. One of the detectives, having learned that Jean had poured concrete under the house, asks his superiors for permission to dig up the site, but the request is denied. Since there is no evidence that a crime has occurred, the police see no need to conduct an overlay investigation and end the case as unsolved, in effect assuming that Diane just suddenly wanted a change and would return in a few weeks. Time passes, and eventually the children somehow get used to their mother's absence, although they still hope that one day she will come home. Jean works at the factory during the day, then comes home and serves the children a meal. During this time, the man is dating a woman named Kitty Andrews, a divorcee who has a 6-year-old son, so often his new girlfriend and child are also guests at home. Kitty works part-time as a go-go dancer and, she later admits, hopes Jean will marry her. Also to her, Jean says his wife has abandoned both him and the children. He is so sure that Diane will never return that he lets Kitty wear her clothes. 4 months pass. It is exactly January 9th, 1967, shortly before midnight. Jean is in the laundry room, located not far from the house. The neighbor living next door to him is just getting ready for bed when he suddenly smells smoke. So he calls his wife and together with her looks outside. There is a fire in the windows of Keidel's kitchen and outside by the kitchen door. The two immediately run there, while their daughter calls the fire department. The call comes in at exactly 11:48 p.m. Reaching the burning house, Keidel's neighbor sees 9-year-old Greg jumping through his bedroom window. At this time, other residents of the area also run towards the house. They all hear the terrifying screams of Keidel's trapped children. Some try to go inside, but the fire is so strong and apparently spreading so rapidly that they are forced to give up. Some loudly shout to the girls to go to Greg's room and also jump through the window, but no one knows if the trapped children can hear anything. What takes place in the burning house during the fire is known from later accounts of the victims. So it is Susie, the oldest girl, who first notices that there is a fire in the house. Susie immediately runs to the room of the younger children, wakes them up, pulls them out of their beds, and tries to lead them outside. But there is smoke everywhere, terribly biting and almost impossible to breathe. The children move toward the exit with the greatest difficulty. Suddenly, Lori remembers that she left her favorite soft toy, Winnie the Pooh, in Susie's room and turns back. She starts to run, but is suddenly consumed by flames. The girl falls to the floor, screaming and crying from pain and terror. Susie reaches her and, wanting to protect her younger sister, lays down on top of her and covers her with her body. Susie repeats that help will come soon. She assures that she will never leave Lori alone again. Lori later recalls that she was sure at the time that she was just dying. Firefighters carry first 8-year-old Kelly out of the burning house, then Susie and Lori in turn, and lay them on the ground one next to the other. Their bodies are burned, and it is unclear if the girls are alive. One of the neighbors recognizes Lori and sees the skin coming off her body in whole huge flaps. The aftermath of the fire is dramatic. Although Greg manages to escape from the burning house, Susie and Kelly die on the way to the hospital. Lori suffers third-degree burns over almost her entire body and fights for her life for days. But her body overcomes successive crises, and finally it is known that Lori will live, which the doctors unanimously consider a miracle. At the same time, it is certain that 12-year-old Susie saved her younger sister's life. Experts investigating the scene of the fire find a melted pot on the stove. Since the tap belonging to the pot's location is set in the on position, they consider the fire an accident. However, the investigators are not left with doubts, as Diane still gives no sign of life, and they are convinced that wherever she was, she would have returned home immediately, having heard about the death of her children. Lori leaves the hospital after 4 months. Local newspapers publish photos of a smiling little girl in a pretty dress and wig. Lori had to have her head shaved. Her father rebuilds the burned house with the money obtained from insurance. Lori lives in it for the next few years with her father and her brother. Years pass, the case of Dianne Keidel and the fire at her house gradually falls into oblivion. It's 1993, 27 years have passed since Dianne Keidel went missing. On June 9, 33-year-old Lori Romanek arrives at the Phoenix police station. The woman brings a self-written statement in which she testifies that as a 5-year-old child she witnessed her father kill her mother and then bury her in the garden. Lori also reports that the day after her mother was murdered, her father poured cement on the grave, and that this layer of cement is the foundation of the terrace that was later built, so beneath it lie the remains of her murdered mother. The fact that this confession comes only so many years later is explained by the woman's paralyzing fear of her father over the years. Here are the first words of her letter. I feel obliged to inform the authorities about what I witnessed as a child. First of all, I must emphasize very clearly how great is my fear of my father's revenge. When I was a child, my father repeatedly told me, I called you into this world, I can remove you from it again. He also told me that if I didn't live with him, I would go to a children's prison. This man beat me repeatedly from the time I was a child, and has tried to use violence against me since I became an adult. The police officer in charge of the case, Ed Reynolds, is skeptical about this confession. However, on the other hand, the woman gives the impression of credibility and her words sound sincere. But investigators need evidence. It will be difficult to get it now. Dianne Keidel, Lori Romanek's father, has remarried, sold his house and lives at the other end of town. And the policeman is hesitant to ask the new owners for permission to demolish the terrace, especially since he only has a confession referring to events 27 years ago. But if the terrace isn't demolished, the case won't get off the ground at all. Lori is very frustrated by this and assumes that the police simply don't believe her. She also fears that her father, meanwhile, will find out that his daughter has testified against him. Despite Lori's fears, the police are not giving up trying to find some solution. Detective Reynolds is searching everywhere for information on a method that would allow him to check the place under the terrace in such a way as not to damage it. This search takes nearly a year. Finally, the detective comes across a company called Neck Research, which recommends the use of a special radar system. This device allows you to look under the ground and determine whether its structure is altered. While the detection of such a change does not yet determine anything, as its causes may vary, it can be a starting point for further conclusions. Detective Reynolds decides to use the radar. The owners of the house previously owned by the Keidels agree. As the specialists move the radar across the terrace floor, in the corner of the terrace the device signals a disturbance in the ground structure of about 180 by 60 centimeters. The investigator finds that this is exactly the same spot Lori pointed out to him earlier. The police gradually remove the cement from the top, and already at a depth of 30 centimeters they spot a fragment of a human skull. Within hours, other parts of the skeleton are also found, in addition to pieces of clothing, a bra and a belt. The neck of the skeleton is wrapped in nylon tights. Lori is absolutely certain that the skeleton found belongs to her mother, but the police need evidence that it is actually Diane. There's a problem with that, however, because identifying the victim's identity with a DNA test is made impossible by the bacteria in the grave. Even the teeth and the marrow inside them are too damaged. Specialists are looking for other solutions. A study of the structure of the root of the tree that pierced the skull is being conducted. While it doesn't make it possible to determine the exact time when the skeleton was deposited in the ground, it makes it possible to conclude that it certainly took place before 1978. The results of anthropological examinations turn out to be decisive. Based on these, it is first determined that the skeleton belongs to a white woman between 160 and 165 centimeters tall, between 20 and 40 years old, and that the woman in question had given birth to at least 2 children. Another study conducted using a technique known as superimposition based on comparing the bones of the skeleton with a skeleton of the person's face reconstructed from a photograph of the person provides definitive confirmation that it is Diane's skeleton. The above findings lead police to arrest 61-year-old Dianne Keidel and charge him with murder. During the trial, Lori takes the witness stand and presents a detailed account of events 27 years ago. Here's how she remembers that evening and that night. Her mother leaves the house to meet her father at a restaurant. She is wearing a blue dress. She says goodbye to her children, who are about to go to bed. Quite late, that is, around 11 p.m., Diane's father calls home. The phone is answered by Susie and she says that Mom is not home yet. Then, as Lori later deduces, her father drives up to their house and waits for her mother. When Diane shows up around midnight, an argument and screams are heard. Lori and Susie wake up and go out into the hallway to see what's going on. They stand on the first floor by the stair railing and look at their arguing parents. At one point, Diane notices the children and stands still for a moment. Her husband takes advantage of this moment of inattention and hits her on the head with all his strength. Diane falls backwards on the floor and hits her head hard. The girls run to the room and hide in the closet there. They are aware that their father noticed that they witnessed the argument and saw the final scene. When Lori and Susie finally emerge from their hiding place in the closet, they run to the window. A terrifying sight appears to their eyes. The mother is lying on the concrete platform in front of the pool and not moving. The sound of digging in the ground with a shovel can also be heard. The next day, at this spot, the father pours a fresh layer of concrete. Lori Romanek believes that 4 months later her father deliberately set fire to the house so that she and her siblings would die in the flames. According to Lori, his motive was to eliminate witnesses to his wife's murder. Moreover, he repeatedly threatened his daughter that he would kill her if she mentioned to anyone what she saw on that day. The trial has lasted quite a while, also because its subject is also the issue of compensation for the carelessly conducted investigation on the causes of the fire. In 1995, Dianne Keidel is convicted of murdering his wife Diane. Why only after 27 years? Trying to answer this question requires taking into account the psychological conditions of the situation Lori was stuck in for years. First of all, as a child, she witnessed the death of her own mother. However, it is worth noting right away that at first, as a child, she interpreted many things differently than an adult would have done. So, as Lori explained years later, she did not immediately understand what it meant to bury a body in the garden. At the time, she thought her mother had gone into winter sleep, as animals do. She even wanted to dig a hole in the ground so she could feed her mother, but this was forbidden by her father. She even remembers that she kept asking various neighbors, "Could you wake up my mother?" Today, Lori is sure that if any of them had started asking her at the time what was actually going on, she probably would have told them what scene she saw in the garden at night. It wasn't until a year after the events of that terrible night that an incident occurred during which Lori realized the terrible truth about her mother's death. It was when she went with her father to the funeral of his friend Michael, killed in the Vietnam War. Standing over the casket, Lori asked, "Daddy, when is he going to wake up again?" Her father replied, "Never. He's dead. He will be buried today." Lori became hysterical. "Wake him up! Wake him up!" She began to shout. She couldn't calm down. She wanted to make everyone realize that Michael must be woken up, that he absolutely must not be allowed to be buried in the ground. In any case, that's when it came to Lori's consciousness that her mother wasn't sleeping in the yard, but that she was dead and that she would never come back. She also began to understand that the perpetrator of her death was her father. Along with this, however, came fear. As a child, Lori had a memory of how afraid her older sister Susie was of her father, especially when the topic of her mother came up in conversations after the memorable night. Susie was very careful to make sure Lori never spoke in front of her father about what had taken place in the garden. Lori, the older she got, understood that Susie was panic-stricken and afraid of her father. Fear of her father also dominated Lori's life. It accompanied her throughout her childhood and teenage years. Lori was a classic victim of violence. Her father beat her, sometimes so long and hard that on more than one occasion household members, such as her father's partner, had to restrain him. He also abused her psychologically. Here is what she herself says about it. He told me that I was a slut like my mother and that one day I would be a slut like my mother. I was immensely afraid of my father, and this fear settled somewhere at the bottom of my soul. He is a horrible man, a bad man. I think he wanted to destroy me personally or destroy me emotionally, so that in the future I would not be able to tell the truth. Fear accompanied Lori even later, when she married and moved out of the house. She had only sporadic contact with her father, but she was still afraid of him and told no one about the memorable night in 1966. Therefore, the path to the confession that Lori made years later was extremely long and difficult. There is another issue that Lori had to struggle with. It was the psychological effects of the fire, the trauma, the terrifying dreams, and, on top of that, the guilt that her sister died solely because of her. Lori otherwise felt unworthy of such a sacrifice, and it took her many years to overcome this feeling. Today, Lori Romanek is a person who finds support in her faith, is optimistic about the future and, as she points out, values the fact that she managed to survive. Thanks for listening. Goodbye and stay safe.